All right, good evening, everybody. I'm Daniel Drexler. I'm the corporate officer for the city, and I'm just going to start this session off. Today's event here this evening, we're going to focus primarily on the floodplain mapping. A lot of this project has been underway actually since 2016. A lot of you guys don't know that. We put it in 2016 into the capital plan to basically plan for future grant opportunities. In 2017, then we applied for a bunch of grants. Two of them were awarded, one in late 2017, the other one in early 2018. And then we went out and hired a consultant, which was Urban Systems at the end of the day, to do the project for us, do the floodplain mapping update. Council had a presentation on this, draft presentation in August, where they had the opportunity to see some of the early models, talk to staff about it, talk to the engineers about it, get feedback, put in some input. We ran a couple other models just to see what options there are. So tonight we're basically showing the community and the public the first time the full presentation. At the end of the day, this will help guide a lot of the planning decisions and create real good informed decision making for council and for the community for probably decades to come. So thank you everybody for coming out today, and those that are going to be watching on the video in a day or two, thanks Les for streaming or filming this. Here's Mayor Taylor.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's magic. It's high science. It's the best that they could pull together in terms of giving you the real picture of what's possible out there in terms of flooding. So I'm really impressed with the grants they've applied for and how they've used the technology. We had some new technology being used, so very impressive. And our next speaker is the one that's been behind a lot of that, Graham Watt.
Thank you, Mayor Taylor. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'll introduce in a moment our colleagues from Urban Systems. This project really started, as Daniel said, in 2016 with some initial looks at getting some mapping in the, and why would we want to actually look at floodplain mapping, let's say 2 years before a flood like that happened last year? Pretty much we did not know about how bad it could be. We knew that there could be a problem. We also knew that the river itself had a floodplain that functioned to carry water and spread it across the landscape. And looking back at the floodplain maps from the early 1990s, everything was different. There's more houses, there's more infrastructure, a lot of things have changed. So it's filling in our gaps, helping us know what the risks were. And then we had a small flood in 2017 that was, I think, a really good wake-up call to the fact that we should get our data going. And so we applied for grants and talked with Urban Systems about what the possibilities were for a new product that used the best new technology. And it was really exciting to learn about what was possible with Cameron Gady here, who's an engineer and hydrologist at Urban Systems. He studies how water moves across the landscape. He studies how human systems like dams and dikes interact with that flow of water and helps communities plan for these major changes in their systems. So he and Joel Short, who's a planner with Urban Systems, will be talking tonight about what we did briefly, what we learned as a city, how we'll be going into the floodplain, new floodplain bylaw and other planning approaches, and then we'll wrap it up with a little bit of discussion about changes in the planning regime that will come from this in the future, and have times for questions and answers. I know we'll be focusing mostly on the floodplain mapping, trying to get a sense for the science. I think it's really good to look also about how this could affect what you do on your properties in the floodplain in the future, especially for major redevelopment. It will help inform decisions, and it also might bring a couple of changes. So thanks for your interest, and this will be a first of a few conversation about the floodplain bylaw. So I'll pass it on to Cameron.
Okay, thank you, Graham. I have to admit I'm a big fan of not doing a lengthy presentation where I just talk and talk and talk. So if you do have a question as we're going through this, please put up your hand. I'll try and keep an eye out for everybody, and I'll try and answer questions if you have them as we're going through this. Excuse me. Can we flip to the first slide here? So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview about what I'm going to talk about tonight. A little bit of the background, some of which Graham has covered already. Some of the standards and guidelines that we use when we are doing studies of this sort. A bit of information about the climate and hydrology, which is really the foundation of a flood study of this sort. Some of the mechanics of the flood modeling process itself, and then Joel is going to come up and talk about the floodplain bylaw. Can we flip to the next slide, please? Okay, so most of you are aware, Graham has done the introduction here. The people from the city of Grand Forks that we work with most closely were Graham Watt and Dolores Sheets. I don't know, Dolores is not here tonight, is she? There she is. Hi, Dolores. And then from Urban Systems, there's me and Joel Short, but there's a few people in our other offices that helped out with this as well. Brendan Pauls was one of the people. He does GIS and modeling work, was instrumental in helping us out with this. Next slide, please. Okay, as Graham had said, a bit of background. The 2017 flood, in a lot of circumstances in communities like this, there's what we call the shot across the bow or something like that gets people more concerned about the flood hazard. The 2017 Frechette was really the place where we became involved. It created some flooding, got people concerned about the adequacy of the maps that had been created in 1992. And as I was saying to one of the people in the meeting here, our various levels of government, provincial and federal, have become increasingly concerned about the impacts of floods on communities and the damage that it causes. And so a number of years ago, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, they got much more interested in providing funding to communities to actually do preventative, mitigative studies, and so programs were made available. As Graham had said, the city of Grand Forks was able to secure a nice pot of funding to undertake this program, and we were actually just getting started on the flood mapping study. There's sort of a typical way in which these things unfold, and it's often a bit of a hypothetical exercise because it's not necessarily a result of a real event. But in this particular case, just as we were getting started, the 2018 flood event happened, and at a personal level, I understand that it really has an impact on a community. It's always unfortunate to see that, and I thought I would take this opportunity to say, we understand that there are people and there are people's lives that are involved and impacted with this kind of stuff. It is largely an engineering science type exercise, but there are real people that are affected when these things happen. Next slide, please. Yes, so the 2018 flood happened, and of course this is an image of looking down at Johnson Flat, taken from a drone. Flip to the next slide, please. Okay, some of the standards and guidelines. So there are a number of documents that are available. We use them as guidance when we are doing the steps that we need to do. They control, or they don't control, they give us guidance with respect to what we should do, and in some circumstances what we must do. There's a couple of documents up there that are, the Professional Engineers Association produces guideline documents that make sure that there's a consistent approach that is being taken from community to community when flood maps are being produced, when flood hazard studies are being undertaken. And then there's also a series of federal government documents to bring a degree of consistency across Canada. Those are produced by Natural Resources Canada, and it's the bottom three. But the key is, without getting into the details of any of those, that there are standards and guidelines that are applied to bring a degree of consistency to the production of flood maps in communities. Okay, climate and hydrology. So the things that we use is there's a number of flow recording stations on both the Kettle, well, most of them are on the Kettle, there's one on the Granby, but there's a number of flow recording stations in the region that we use. Some of them are operated and maintained by Water Survey of Canada. The one on the Granby, for example, is a Water Survey of Canada site. And then there's, because the Kettle runs back and forth across the US border, there's two national oceanographic stations that we use on the Kettle. One at Midway, just south of Midway, and the other one's at Laurier. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but in a watershed, like sometimes a watershed is prone to flooding because of significant rain events. That's not the case in the Kettle and the Granby. There are significant upstream snow accumulations that can happen, and in fact, the winter of 2017-2018 was one of the most significant snow accumulation years in recent history, and that combined with spring rainfall creates the type of event, the extreme event that we saw in 2018. But the response of the watershed from year to year is pretty typical. And this next slide, if you can flip to the next slide, please. This is actually the Water Survey of Canada information from the Granby River. And essentially the three lines represent, the green line represents the most extreme event that had happened up until that time. Now when this was produced, we don't have the 2018 data. This is does not include that 2018 data. So the 2018 flood does not show up on there. In fact, that green line would be up to the top of the page if the 2018 flood was added to this. And that's based on the amount of time that the flow recording station has been in place. So it's not all the events that have ever happened on the Granby. The blue one represents the lowest flow that has been recorded on that station. And then the red one is a particular year of data. In fact, that was the 2014 data. But what it's intended to represent is that each year, as you get into February, March, and April, the snow starts to come off, and you typically get a peak that occurs around early May, mid-May. That's when the peak of the freshet is normally coming off on the Granby River. And so we have the same information for all of these other stations that we looked at. Next slide, please. One of the factors to consider in a situation like Grand Forks in particular is that you've got two significant rivers coming together. So one of the questions in a study like this is often, is there the timing of the peak of the two events, are they different? Do you have separate flood events that are occurring that you need to be mindful that you have to study one and then you have to study the other separately? But we have coincident data for the Granby River and the Kettle River, 47 years of it overlap, and in only 5 of those years was the peak of the two flows outside of 24 hours of each other. So they're recorded, sometimes they're recorded on exactly the same day, sometimes they're recorded on consecutive days, but they're always within plus or minus 1 day, except for 5 days out of the 47 years where there would be maybe 2 or 3 days difference between, and those are on lower flow years. But what it tells us is that studying this as a single event is an acceptable way to do this study. Flip to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'd mentioned the flow recording stations. Yeah, thank you. I'd mentioned the flow recording stations, and this is just an aerial image of British Columbia. You can see Kelowna and Big White and Midway and Soyuz in there, Grand Forks. All of those blue dots represent a Water Survey of Canada flow recording station that has a reasonable period of record where it's got useful data. If you flip to the next slide, please. The ones that are circled in red are the ones that we used in our analysis to establish what's called a design flow. So it's essentially a statistical analysis that looks at all of the flow records and analyzes it in the way that one of these guideline documents lays out, and arrives at an estimate of a design flow. And I think it's important to recognize that it is nothing more than an estimate. We have a number, but it is not an absolute number. It has error bars on it. We don't report that, but it's something that people have to be mindful of, is that you're taking a data set and projecting it to create an estimate of a probable event. Although we use a single number, we still do sensitivity analysis to see what the impact of not being that number is. Flip to the next slide, please. And so the numbers that were used in the 1992 study that created the original set of maps, they would have had these numbers, 604 in the Kettle, 450 in the Granby, and a combined flow of 1,054. The observed flow of event, so we actually take the measurements that were available from the flow recording station, so we have the data for that particular day. As you can see in both cases, the flow rate that occurred actually exceeded the 1992 flow estimate. Then when we do our statistical analysis, we get these other numbers. The Granby, as you can see, goes down. The Kettle goes up, but the combined value is on the order of 18 to 20% greater than the 1992 number. So the additional data that we have since the 1992 study was done gives us a better picture of the probability of a particular flow, and it will be different than the 1992 study. That's one of the big differences. Okay, next slide, please. And then, so that's the hydrology part of it. We've essentially done analysis on data sets of water flow records to come up with a number that we're going to use in the model. This is the physical part. In order to characterize the channel, we basically do two key things. One is that we send surveyors out, and some of you may have actually seen them out here in the summer of 2018. So they would be going up and down the river and actually doing a transect across the river. The intent is to pick up the detail of the channel where the river is, because we can do that relatively quickly, and the finer detail is necessary where the incised channel is. We actually do that by physical survey on the ground. The model is actually augmented with LiDAR data, and I'm not sure how familiar people are with LiDAR. It's an acronym, basically light detection and ranging, and it's simply a survey method, aerial survey method that uses light detection, so it shoots laser beams down onto the ground. They reflect back up to a receiver on an airplane, and it because the airplane knows the elevation it's flying, it creates a very accurate. There's a lot of science that goes into it, but the gist is you get a very accurate model, and we use that information in a computer simulation. If you flip to the next slide, these are actually the cross sections. I realize it's not a great slide, but every one of those sets of blue lines that goes across, that would be a surveyor physically walking across the river channel, and they were able to wade across it because we did it in the summer of 2018. So in most places they were able to wade across. There were a couple of spots where they needed a canoe to paddle across because the water was up over their waist or chest or something like that. Okay, flip to the next slide. So this is a result of the LiDAR. And I have to admit, I didn't know whether or not we were going to have a big screen or something here a little bit closer. But one of the things that is apparent in a image like this, and it'll be more interesting when we even go to the next slide. Don't flip there yet, but when we go to the next slide, you'll see the detail. But essentially, it gives us a lot of detail about what is actually on the ground. It's not perfect, make no mistake about it, but it increases the accuracy compared to what would have gone into the 1992 maps, because the 1992 maps would have been produced by some fellow putting a ruler across there and actually measuring the distance between the contours and using that in the computer model. So we create a surface from this LiDAR information, and that's what gets used in the computer model. If you can flip to the next slide, this is just a closer image. Everybody recognize where that is? Okay, that is the park, and you can see features like one of the things that stuck out to me is there's a little playground right on the end of that street there, where I think there's some concrete blocks around, and the kids play inside. Well, that's the kind of level of detail. So features like that actually jump out. I think that's what do you call it? BMX track. There's a campground there that you can actually see the depressions between the parking pads in the LiDAR information. So that's the level of accuracy that gets produced and incorporated into the model. One of the things I often say is that, just because you can measure something real precisely doesn't mean that it's accurate. It just improves the level of precision with respect to the work that we're doing. Okay, flip to the next slide. And so one of the other things that we have when we do our creating a model, one of the things that we want to do is calibrate it. And calibration is basically taking a known flow rate, and you will recall that we had the measured flow rate from the 2018 flood, and a known water surface elevation, and then there's a handful of parameters in the model that we can massage. Essentially, they're called friction parameters. It is the resistance of the water flowing over the ground. The more resistance, the deeper the water has to be to move a flow rate. And so using the flow rate information, using the ground surface information, and using information like an aerial photograph that was taken at the height of the flood and comparing that to the terrain map, we can more accurately calibrate our model so that we increases the confidence in the results. So those are the three main pieces of information that we use: ground information, hydrologic information to create a peak flow, and something to calibrate the model with. And then when we're satisfied that we can reproduce the results of a flood like this, then we know that the model can actually be run for a design event. In this particular case, the design event and the real event that happened in 2018, they are for all intents and purposes the same thing. Yes, there are differences in the flow rate, but when you think about the accuracy of the estimate in the first place, the differences between this and the design event are really not that much. You essentially had the regulatory design event as the floodplain study was being undertaken. Okay, and then if you could flip to the next slide, I think these are so this is the comparison that we do. It's essentially just showing you that we run a model that is comparing the extents of the calibration event and the model, and when we get those very close, we're satisfied that we have a calibrated model. Flip to the next slide, please. And these are the results. Now there's a bunch of animations here. They're just going to run through. That is Almond Gardens. Okay, now we're in Johnson Flats. And essentially what this is showing is that the results of the model show the main channel is where the vast majority of the flow occurs, but there are these overflow areas where water spills out, and it doesn't just flood there. It's actually flowing through there. It's actually moving through there. So it's not just like a lake where a water surface elevation comes up and floods a beachfront. There's water flowing through those areas. Depending on the circumstances, there can be greater or lesser extents. That's why encroachment in floodplains can be a challenge, where too much development happens in the floodplain and it actually changes or alters the flow pattern. I'm not sure if anybody wants to, or has any specific questions. I'm going to get them to move to the next slide. You get the gist of it? Okay, next slide, please. One more. Okay, this is another animation that essentially, this is a time series. So rather than the first one, which was basically showing flow paths at a specific flow rate, this is a time series. So we create what's called a hydrograph. It's that image that I'd shown you of the Granby River, where the water is coming up and then going back down. And that's what you see here, is that as the flow increases, so this is now, Thursday, Friday of the flood weekend. This is where things unfold. Basically, the water rises, it floods this area first, it continues on as it flows through, and then when it's at the peak, that would have been the animation that was showing the flow paths, and now things are draining away. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So you did this all the way up to our creek?
No. We own our work is only within the city of Grand Forks. Our work was for the city of Grand Forks, and so we study from one boundary to the other boundary. We go a little bit outside into the regional district, but Grand Forks is where we're focused on. Next slide, please. This is just a flyover. I don't know that this one's all that great, but it just gives you aerial perspective as you fly along. And this is one of the nice things about the LiDAR data, is that you can show things three-dimensionally better than you certainly could at some point in the past with simply paper maps. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, yeah.
So I'm looking at the purple, like in South Purple,
Yep.
North Purple. Is that the depth that we're seeing?
In this particular case, it's the depth, yes. This particular image is showing the depth. So the purple, that's the main channel. That is where, under the vast majority of circumstances, most of the flow actually runs through the main channel. It's only when you get more extreme events that it spills out. And, as you can imagine, pretty much every year, you get a big flow through that main channel. So that main channel is always hydraulically active. It's every 10 years or 25 years where enough water is generated that it spills out. It may have an impact on one particular year, but then there can be 20 years before the water ever gets out of the channel again. Stuff grows and land gets altered. Next slide, please. I think I'm almost at the end. Yeah, so all of that analysis ends up producing these floodplain maps, which are they're still in a draft state because they haven't been. We haven't got the final sign off from the city of Grand Forks, but that will be presumably coming in the relatively near future. And then how these floodplain maps actually get used is what my colleague Joel is going to talk about, because I think that was it for me. Any questions before Joel?
Yeah.
Sure.
I looked at money well spent because these flood maps have been around for a lot of years. A couple of things though, with hydrology, snow melt and whatnot. Any indication of what logging, what that has done for the runoff?
Yeah, it wasn't something that we studied in any depth, but it was a question that was asked, and there's a specialist. She works for the Ministry of Forests out of Kamloops, but that is her area of expertise. I can't remember her name right now. I think it's Winkler, but her specialty is the impact of logging, and it is something that the Ministry of Forests is mindful of, that it can't be altering the watershed in such a way that it's causing adverse effects somewhere else. Now, that's not my area of expertise, so I can't speak to it a great deal, other than to say I do know that there are people within the Ministry of Forests who are mindful of that when they are, figuring out what the allowable cut is, where the cut blocks are, all that kind of stuff. And I'm assuming that they're doing their job and that they're doing a good one, but I can't speak to the specifics. We don't see a specific trend in the hydrologic results that would say something has changed in the watershed. There's a degree of uniformity that we would expect to exist. It's actually a degree of randomness is what it is. There's not a trend in one direction or the other.
Is there a really big difference between these new flood maps that you've got with all this technology and ones that were drawn up so long ago that I've seen pictures of them and where the lines are on the floodplains? Is there a big difference that we get our bang for the buck here?
Well, I would say that the city's in the best position to understand whether or not they got the best bang for the buck. There is a difference. The difference in water surface elevation that is calculated based on, the flow rate has gone up based on that. We have 30 years more of annual runoff records that can be used in the statistical analysis compared to what was used in 1999 or 1992. So in 1992, they had a data set that was maybe 50 years long. We have a data set now that is 80 years long. So you have, almost twice as much data. And, I understand that data is just a thing, but we have to rely on what does history tell us about what might happen in the future. So, for one thing, you've got more data, and the data says that the 0.5% probability event, which is the design event that's used for creating maps, that flow rate is higher. The technology is a bit better too in terms of calculating a more accurate water surface elevation. So the number of cross-sections that would have been used in the computer technology that would have been used in 1992, it was good and produced good results. But don't worry, I haven't forgotten about it. But it pales in comparison to what is available today. But I think one of the things to be mindful of is that I talked about accuracy and precision. This is, from my perspective, is about identifying risk and where a certain risk level is, as opposed to saying that the water level is precisely this. But I think, at the very least, the city would come away with comfort that whatever they might have had in the past with the update gives them a better outcome than having not done anything. Can you? Okay, and then don't worry, I'll get.
So one of the big changes, Cameron didn't speak specifically. I'll give him a moment for water here. In the South Ruckle neighborhood, and also in certain areas downtown, the topography, the change in land surface due to the rail grades was not actually accounted for in the old maps. And so you'll see the water flow just kind of go right across the whole floodplain as if there wasn't that rail berm in place, which prevented the flood from going over into the industrial area and the works yard ultimately, which is one of the risks that could have happened. So the new topography, the new maps is that much more accurate. I love that you're downplaying the accuracy, but we're talking about centimeters here, not inches. And that's a big difference, not feet maybe, as the case was. The other thing that I'm thinking at a broader level, these maps do need to be updated periodically, every 10 to 15 years, ideally every 10 years. And we now have a system in place, the base data model, that makes it much easier to actually update. We could hire the next generation of engineers very easily in any consulting firm to update these. If there's a major change, as in new dikes, we actually need to redraw these maps with the new dikes in place to look at how that changes the flood surface. So we now have a future-ready tool. We still have to pick that tool up and use it and not sit on it for 30 years, but we have a future-ready tool that will actually help us in the future. So I just wanted to point that out.
All right. Question here? No, I remember you as well.
On the topic of history and forestry, you said that forestry was not, and their impact on watershed was not factored into this. What was the reason for that, and will it be consolidated, incorporated at a later date as we're looking further logging, further
Yeah, it certainly could. One of the things to be mindful of is that we only do the work that we're hired to do, and a study of that sort could be extensive. I mean, it's a complex piece of science, and so we weren't engaged to do it.
Should that come into play though in future studies? And what was the reason for not expanding it? I understand you're one small organization. Right?
Yep.
Should it have incorporated the forestry industry as well as looking at just the water and how to look through several industries as to how this is affecting?
Yeah, not to dodge your question, but I mean, I just can't speak to whether it should have happened or shouldn't have happened. I know that we weren't engaged to do it. Yeah, and I'm not going to give you a personal opinion. I'm going to give you a perspective. I mean, one of the things that, as Graham said, updating the maps, one of the things that we talk about always with people that in this area of expertise is what we call adaptive management. You know a certain set of facts today, or at least as accurately as you can define the facts today. Things will change in the future. Be mindful that as things change, of what they are and the impact that they have, and how do you adapt when those things happen. So, you know, regardless of what anybody's perspective is on climate change, there's evidence that the climate will change, or is changing, and that may have a significant impact on this. There are certainly other things that are going on. They may have an impact. So being mindful of as things change, revisit the you know, this information, because these things are you know, we're in the hazard avoidance business. That what we want to do is give people the tools that help them understand, okay, how do I avoid being flooded or have my home washed away or whatever the case may be. Understanding this sort of stuff is one of the tools. It's just one of the tools that is used to do that. So sorry for dodging your question about it. Yeah.
Two questions. First, I just want to repeat that I feel that we're facing some very important decisions on data that is missing huge which is forestry practices. I think it's really unfortunate that we're assuming that they didn't play into this. I don't know if I understand that. Role. My first question. My second question is that I feel like I'm sure you understand that the data that you're providing to our town and to other towns is affecting hugely the decisions that are being made. And urban matters, I'd like to know, urban systems, I'd like to know more about it. Is it a national, and who is your boss? Who are you as a subsidiary? Your reports that look lovely are having a significant lives on the ground. And I don't know anything about it, and they seem to have a huge effect on my life.
Right. Oh, okay. And that's a fair point. I mean, I can certainly tell you about me. I'm a professional engineer. I've been practicing. I graduated in 1987, and I've been working in water resources. I'm from Ontario. Don't hold that against me. I've been out here for 27 years. But water resources, hydrology, hydraulics, that's my area of practice. That's the profession that I work in. Urban Systems has been around since 1975. It was a company that was started in Kamloops, British Columbia, which just coincidentally happens to be where I live now. And it was focused on municipal services, and at the time, I mean, the primary municipal services that anybody would have been concerned about are water, sewer, roads, the basic municipal services, and storm drainage. But in urban systems evolution, I mean, it has evolved in the same way that communities have evolved and understood that areas of expertise of this sort were valuable to communities to help them. I mean, what we do is we assist communities in solving their problems. We bring technical expertise to communities to help them solve the fundamental problems or deal with the fundamental problems that they face as communities from the built environment. So we don't do police services or fire services, but basically the built environment is our area of knowledge. And we provide those services to communities on a consulting basis. Is rather than having communities, try and have those professionals in-house, because I got to work a lot of different places doing this sort of stuff, whereas an individual working in Grand Forks can't necessarily be as specialized. Does that help? Or
are you just like a provincial, or like do you have a head office somewhere?
Well, we do. We're not not to get off on too much of a tangent about how we're structured. You can sort of think of us somewhat like a doctor's office practice, where you have professionals who are responsible for their area of expertise. Now, make no mistake, we're a corporation, but Joel and I are owners of the corporation. So we're practicing professionals who are also owners of our company. We don't have a corporate structure where somebody in Cleveland is making decisions about what we're going to do. It's really about practitioners and what they're interested in. Does that help? Okay, you had a question.
Yes, you had mentioned that the rate of flow has increased, so I wanted to double check. Do you mean that over time, when the snow melts and when the peak is coming, it's at a higher rate of flow, so that means our snow is melting more quickly rather than gradually over time?
Okay. No, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you pointed that out. What I'm saying by that is that there's a data set that was used to predict a flow rate of 0.5% or 200-year flow rate in 1992. But because we've got 30 more years of data, when we analyze that data, the number is higher. So imagine in 1992, somebody did a probability analysis on the data that was available, and it would have been about 40 years of data or 50 years of data. And imagine it's like a line that's pointing higher and higher the lower the probability gets. Does that sort of make sense? On an annual basis, you get a kind of a normal freshet, a normal runoff. It happens the same most years. That's a high probability event, a 2-year or a 5-year event. But when you get out to the extreme events, because they don't happen very often, you don't have a lot of data points. Because we've got 30 more years of data points, we've got more of those points that are out on the far end, so we can better predict what the number is, and that number has gone up. So if the graph used to point like this, it now points like that. So that this number out here, which is the 200-year event or the 0.5 probability event, it's the lowest probability of happening in any year. But it has gone up because there's more data points that suggest that number should be higher. Does that make sense? That's right. The hydrology hasn't changed.
Just to double check, you're just focusing on the flood situation, the extreme situation, and comparing those flow rates, not yearly flow rates.
No.
And that was one of the other study that was done earlier, Calibration River Watershed Management Plan, right? So,
Yeah,
the extreme events.
Yes, that's what we're interested in. Yeah. Predicting an extreme event, yes. Predicting is the right word. Sorry, there was a question up here, and then you have another one, right?
I was just curious about your company. So how big is your company? Are you guys looking at just our local boundary, Cooley South area, or are you guys a province-wide company? What kind of span?
Yeah, we're a company. When I joined Urban Systems in 1992, we were a company of about 110 people. We're about 400 now, but we're throughout British Columbia, Alberta. We've got a small office in Saskatchewan. We got a small office in Winnipeg. But we work lots of places. As an example, I'm currently working in Texas right now, the state of Texas. So that's a rare thing. What's that? That's right. They get some serious rain down there, I can tell you that much. Okay, sorry, there was a question up there.
So, are you guys on an on-call basis?
No.
Or do your company have certain sections of BC that your people go out to on a regular basis, or in our case, we had a flood. You were called in.
Yeah, okay, Graham will just answer, sure.
I'm just gonna step in. I appreciate the interest in urban systems as a company. They've been working with the city off and on in many different capacities. I've seen studies in our shelves from the 90s, certainly, probably earlier. And since I think about 2011, 2012, have been regularly part of our consulting engineering practice, where we can call them up to look into something, and then if it's within their scope, they're able to then take care of it and actually do the work. And so it's basically, they have all of our data and they can move on things really quickly. It's basically a standing kind of situation, and it changes periodically from time to time where we ask them to apply again. So it's important to the city to have an organization working with us that knows our data and also has a breadth of engineers and planners that can help us across our different fields of expertise, and that's fairly typical. I enjoy this line of questioning, but I want to redirect to the floodplain science and then Joel into the planning end of this. It's really, really important that we can cover this. If you've got concerns, otherwise concerns about who we're working with, I think you can take that up with management, but other than that, I'd be glad to redirect it onwards.
Well, I would like to get to the point that I was going to make.
Okay, sure.
Okay? That we had a flood and now we see you show up. I've lived in North Ruckle for 10 years. My neighbor built on his property, put a modular home in there. And when he initially put the plans through to Grand Forks, he was told he had to go to the 100-year floodplain. All right? Just before he started construction, the city came to him and said, no, you have to go to the 200-year floodplain, which cost him more money. But during the flood of 2018, he didn't get flooded. His garage did because it's a little lower. But the water did not hit his main floor, which is a bonus. Okay? But that was 10 years ago that he was told he had to go to the 200-year floodplain. But at the same time, our dikes around Ruckle were not touched. Okay? So what level are our dikes at today? Are they at the 100-year floodplain?
You know what, I have to admit, I can't speak to the specifics of your existing dikes.
No, but this is what you guys do, is you guys come in and you analyze the amount of water that's going to come in from the mountains and whatnot, what it's going to do to our rivers, where the water is going to go, okay?
Yeah.
Now, Graham says that you guys have been around this area since 2011. That's 8 years ago, okay? And that's what I'm saying, is 10 years ago, a guy was told in order to build in North Ruckle, you had to go to the 200-year floodplain. Why did not somebody at that time, with the expertise, say, well, maybe we should update our diking system to the 200-year floodplain?
Yeah,
Okay? So at that point, if that would have been done 8 years ago when you guys first started coming in here, we wouldn't have flooded.
okay.
Because the dikes would have been higher enough. And that's what I'm getting at, is that, yes, I would come to a lot of these meetings and listen to a lot of experts, and they say, I'm an expert at this, okay? Listen to one guy at one of the first meetings, he says, I'm an expert on snow. We watched the snowpack for 6 months, okay, to see what it was gonna do. And I said, well, isn't there a way of figuring out like how much water is in that much snow? It's got to come down here, okay? And it has come down a few times in the 29 years that I have lived here, okay? But they said they watched it for 6 months. And all of a sudden we got a flood where our dikes were not up to snuff. And you guys have been around for 8 years monitoring this stuff.
To be clear, I haven't been around for 8 years monitoring this.
He's saying that
our company
like yours has been here. I'm not saying you specifically.
Our company has been here, but I mean, bear in mind that our company is here to serve at the convenience of the city of Grand Forks. They decide what they would like us to help them with. So
Yes,
I'm not familiar with your particular circumstance. I'm sorry about that.
No, but I understand that, but that's what I'm saying. Do you guys look after certain sections of BC and you send guys out on a periodic basis to monitor what's going on in certain communities?
No.
Or do you show up when they call you?
We arrive when somebody calls us and asks them to help us
So
out. with a particular thing.
basically, they shut the doors after the horses left the barn.
Well, I'm not sure I would say that, but
I would.
okay. Was there another question? Okay, and then we're gonna have to move on to Joel here.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. I refer to slide number 7.
Okay.
Significant upstream snow accumulation,
Yes.
spring rainfall,
Yeah.
and snow melt and rain on snow.
Yeah.
To what degree, if any, does the existence of a mountain resort on the Big Lake represent the Grand Forks annually?
Essentially nothing. I mean, it's inconsequential.
Does the water then go the other way?
No, most of Big White ends up down here. The snow on Big White, but the resort doesn't do anything of any significance that would have an impact. I mean, when I say inconsequential, whether the resort was there or not, you wouldn't notice the difference. Yeah. Does that help you? Okay.
Somewhat.
Okay.
It's a bigger subject.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to turn it over to Joel now, and he's going to talk about Joel stuff. So, that was like a half an hour ago that I introduced you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Cameron. Okay, so could we have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk about how these maps that Cameron was talking about get translated into bylaws that your city will then implement. So right now, you have an existing floodplain bylaw, and some references were made to it in this discussion. And it's a fairly standard floodplain bylaw. The province created some standard bylaws that a lot of communities adopted, and that was adopted in 1993, and it was based on the 1992 floodplain maps. And that's these black and white maps that you can see up here in one of the panels, and we have them up here as well. So that's your current bylaw. So I can have the next slide, please. The existing floodplain bylaw, it was revisited in 2004. There were some revisions to the legislation. So before 2004, if somebody wanted to make an exemption or a change, they had to go to the ministry. So if there was the Ministry of Environment, I think it was, and if there was some, say somebody wanted to build something, they wanted to be a little different than what's in the bylaw, they'd have to go to the ministry for the exemption. In 2004, they kind of downloaded that responsibility onto municipalities. So now it's the municipality, the city, has to issue the exemption. So that's why the main change that happened in 2004, it was updated, but that places that somewhat heavy responsibility on the city to decide whether somebody should be exempt from the regulations. They would probably be required to have, say, an engineer's report and perhaps put a covenant on title, but it puts them in that situation. So anyways, that was why the changes were made in 2004. So now the next slide, please. There is also provincial legislation, and it's like you have a toolbox with a lot of different tools in it that can help you manage the floodplain. And so there's a number of tools, and I'll just tell you about some of these tools. So the Local Government Act gives the city a number of tools, and the primary among those tools is the floodplain bylaw. So it sets out elevations that buildings have to meet, and it sets out kind of an area within which those elevations have to be met. And so this new mapping identifies the elevations with more accuracy. And indeed, in some cases, the elevations are, say, a half a meter, even a meter higher than what they were in the 1992 map. So we've got much better information to say, if you're going to build something within this floodplain area, it's got to be a certain height. And that's what that bylaw says. does. It says how high it has to be, it refers to the maps, and it also sets out distances away from streams, for example. It would say you've got to be set back a certain distance from the Granby or the Kettle River. It covers off a few more details than that, but that's basically what floodplain bylaw does. There's also official community plans. So official community plans, that's a tool that the city has to plan forward, look into the future, and identify what land uses should go where should the future city go, and maybe there are some changes that you make. Perhaps there are some areas that should stay as, for example, agricultural rather than changing to more intensive uses, or maybe they should be parkland, for example, if they're located in areas that might be more subject to flooding. So this mapping, the new mapping, provides a better, more accurate tool to move forward with the official community plan. And I'll touch on that a bit more later. Then there's also another tool is the zoning bylaw. So the zoning bylaw can regulate things like setbacks, building locations on lots. So that's another tool that you have. And then you've also got development permit guidelines. And development permit guidelines, they are a tool that identifies areas where there are special, say, hazards or certain conditions. They actually can also be used for design guidelines in terms of the form and character and shape of buildings, but the most relevant is hazardous conditions. So a development permit guideline can say, if you're building within this area, these are certain guidelines that you should meet. So that's another tool. The community charter, which is a separate act, gives the city certain powers. It gives the building inspector the power to require reports or covenants if the building inspector sees certain things that, or thinks that things could be subject to flooding. And then there's also the Land Title Act, which gives the approving officer, the subdivision approving officer, the authority to require reports and covenants. So imagine it as a toolbox with all these different tools that the city can use. So that just kind of gives you a bit of a context of the provincial legislation that's available. So now, next slide, please. So one of the key outputs of this exercise is a new floodplain bylaw. And so one of the key things that's going to happen is you're going to replace the old floodplain maps, take those out, put in the new floodplain maps. So those will be these maps, the draft of which you've been looking at up at these tables here. And those maps also revise the flood construction level. And the flood construction level is the 200-year flood level plus 0.6 meters of freeboard, which is about 2 feet. So basically, you've got a flood construction level that ensures that buildings are about 2 feet, 0.6 meters above where the water is going to get to in a 1 in 200 year flood. And let me just, this is actually right from the legislation. I'll just read out this one phrase here. So once that's been established, and the maps establish that level, the flood construction level. Once that's established, then the underside of any floor system or top of any pad supporting any space or room, including a manufactured home that is used for dwelling purposes, business, or the storage of goods susceptible to damage by floodwater must be above the flood construction level. So that's pretty close to what your bylaw is now. It's just that the levels are more accurately determined, and they're different, and they're set out in these in the new maps. But that's basically what one of the key items that's set out in the bylaw is that buildings need to be above a certain level. Next slide, please. Another component of the floodplain bylaw is floodplain setbacks. So there are, it sets out set distances from the natural boundary of the Kettle or the Granby Rivers, and a set distance from the landslide toe of any standard dike. So a dike that exists, it sets out a setback for that. Now, it also sets out general exemptions. So your current bylaw has some general exemptions in it, and the new bylaw will probably have some general exemptions. And those are things like the regulations might not apply if you're doing a renovation to a building, for example, or if you're doing a small addition. Or also, one example is if you've got a carport or a garage. The thought being that you can, move the car out of that and there's less potential for major damage. So those are some general exemptions that are possible in a bylaw. And then there are also site-specific exemptions, which are exemptions that are made upon application to the city. So that would be setting out, for example, that you need an engineer's report and that perhaps there need to be a restrictive covenant on the property, sort of a notice on title that you've built this thing that is different than what the floodplain bylaw requires. So that's the floodplain bylaw. Could I get the next slide, please? Then in terms of the zoning bylaw, remember I mentioned that's one of the tools in the toolbox. One of the things that could be considered, for example, is a build-to line, which would say you could possibly require buildings in flood-prone areas to be constructed within a certain distance of roads. So, for example, and this is an idea we're thinking about as an example, you could say, oh, okay, well, if you're building in a flood-prone area, make sure that you build the home maybe closer to the roads, so then you're not having a home that's out on this kind of isolated island surrounded by water that's kind of hard to get to if there's a flood. It would be closer to the road. That would make it easier to get to access if there's a flood, for emergency purposes, for evacuation, for moving things back and forth in and out, rather than being in this kind of island out in the middle of a wet area. So that's one idea that a zoning bylaw can be used for. And development permits, as I mentioned, that's another tool. You can protect against hazardous conditions such as flooding. You can also protect the natural environment and ecosystems. And the current official community plan does have an environmental development permit area that aims to protect natural areas. One of the things that could happen is you could consider a more site-specific approach, so that if there's a certain situation, you could require a bit more analysis and study to determine where exactly would be the best place to put a building, and how might you deal with the landscaping, those types of things, in an area that might be more prone to flooding. And you could also require, it gives you the authority to require specific engineering reports to ensure that if you build something, it can be built safely. So those are some implementation tools. Another one, next slide please, is, as I mentioned, the official community plan. So under the official community plan, and these are some actual maps from your current official community plan, the flood plain is set out in the current official community plan, and that can be amended with new floodplain mapping information. So the official community plan, it sets out land use designations for different areas. So when you're looking forward, you could avoid residential or commercial development within a certain distance of floodplain areas. You could avoid developing existing agriculture or open space lands when you're thinking forward. Another useful output of the analysis, of the mapping analysis, is a 1 in 20 year flooding. So the analysis produces 1 in 20 year flooding. So it identifies for sure, the mapping sets out the 1 in 200 year flooding, but also the 1 in 20 year flooding is interesting. It's like, these are areas that are going to flood more frequently. What types of land use decisions do you make when you know that maybe every 20 years this piece is going to flood? Maybe that should be parkland, or maybe, sorry?
2017 is the example.
Right, yeah, 2017 is an example of about a 1 in 20 year flood level of activity. So it allows you to think what types of land uses would make more sense if we know it's going to flood every 20 years or so. So next slide, please. Oh yeah, another report that will be useful in planning ahead is the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. So this is an initiative that has been undertaken by the city maybe about a year and a half ago or so. Yeah, and so it provides information that supports avoiding encroachment on the floodplain, and it talks about the value of the floodplain, and the floodplain value can be protected and conserved while managing the risk, resulting in a greater net benefit to society. So the benefits, it sets out the benefits of having this natural capital asset. It's something that's useful, where you're kind of employing the floodplain to help manage the overall impacts on the community. So it's good to have a functioning floodplain as a natural capital asset. So that's another tool that can be used for planning and moving forward. So, and I think that's it for our slides. What's the next slide? Questions. Okay, there we go. So that concludes our presentation, and now we're open to questions about the bylaw or any other questions that myself or Graham or Cameron can answer. Yes, sir.
Yes, what I have out of all of this, in the current bylaw as it stands, you have to build a residence, my numbers may be a little low here, about 555 meters above sea level.
Well, it depends on where you're located. I think it's about, what, 550? 550, 515.
515.
But say, yeah, use that as an example.
550 meters in the floodplain. So what you're saying, the new bylaw will be subject then to 515.6 meters? Is that what I'm understanding?
Something like that.
Something like that. Well, it actually depends on the new maps. And so the new maps show kind of lines of elevation, what elevation you need to build where, which changes as it kind of goes
Well,
along.
the water seeks its own level, so you still got to be so high.
Yep, yeah, you want to be like 0.6 meters, like 2 feet above where the flood would be in the 1 and 200 year flood.
So in the floodplain, that would be 515.6 meters, would it not?
Well, it depends where you are.
The river is still.
It's,
Oh, I'm sorry, okay, right.
The west end of Grand Forks is higher than when you're on the east end of Grand Forks.
yeah, and you should actually,
Okay, I'm considering the grading, it's almost nil, but.
No, it's almost 10 meters difference. It's basically the height of this.
Well, is it from, that I didn't know, from how far west to how far east?
Basically, from the west boundary of Grand Forks, it's almost 523 meters, and on the east boundary, east boundary of Grand Forks, it's 513. So it's a 10-meter drop.
I didn't realize it was that much.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question, yes, you were the
Yes, good seminar. I was wondering if you could tell me the conclusion of all this study. Is it coming close to an end?
Yes.
Yeah, and actually one of the culminations of it will be the actual adoption of the bylaw of the floodplain.
And have you got any input as to what the city will do with all this information other than to put it in a binder, save it for 15, 10 years for the next study? Has there been any input from you folks to the council of the city? What can be done to give us quicker notice? Are they going to do any damming anywhere that has been spoken of? Do you have any of that information?
Well, no, that's, sorry, I mean,
Again,
once again, not to dodge your question, but we had a scope of work that we were engaged to do, and to essentially produce maps that can be used to update a bylaw. Now, the city of Grand Forks updating their bylaw, that's essentially something that the elected leaders of the municipality will do or not do, as the case may be. That's not something that we're involved in.
that's what they wanted to accomplish, was to figure out where the bylaw.
Yeah, essentially, as Graham said earlier, part of the normal process is to look at are the tools that you have in place adequate. So this was a revisitation of the adequacy of the tools. What the community does with it, it remains with the community to figure out. But we only take it so far as technical people providing service.
Specifically, just the immediate next steps on this is the introduction of a draft bylaw to the committee of the whole. Staff would bring it forward as kind of the culmination of this existing process, and we'd be able to ask some questions still about the implications of, you'll notice Joel said setbacks a certain distance. That number hasn't been decided yet, and there's implications either way, so we want to ask their planning and engineering expertise about some of those numbers that haven't been set yet, and then we go through the normal bylaw process for the floodplain bylaw this winter, and then the official community plan and zoning bylaws to the extent that council wishes to make changes in those larger regulations. That's in the work plan over the coming year when we're addressing changes in the official community plan, pending the council decisions on that funding.
Oh, great.
There's a question.
Oh, yes.
Apparently, we also have a dual jurisdiction thing between floodplains and riparian areas. where sometimes the floodplain gets to encroach on riparian or it goes the other way. These are major changes to our freshet flows and water levels. How does the province and the municipalities of BC cooperate in not getting in one another's way on this?
Well, so interesting point. In a community plan, oftentimes there are areas that are set out as the floodplain areas, and those are often also the same areas as environmentally sensitive areas, riparian areas, areas that are important to be preserved as natural habitat. So oftentimes those can actually be complementary, because you're saying you shouldn't build here because it's floodplain, and also you shouldn't build here because it's a natural area or a riparian area that's important for fish habitat and important for as natural habitat. So oftentimes those things can be.
I mean, it's flow channel. Yeah, you know, fish habitat is important, but where we actually fill in flow channels, and that changes everything.
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean,
how does the province and the municipality?
Well, the province has certain responsibilities which are set out in legislation with respect to what they are concerned about, and the municipality, I mean, it's a subordinate level of government. It has other responsibilities. The province tends to be concerned with things like overall impacts, whereas communities tend to be responsible for what are the things that people within the community are actually doing in the built environment. Does that make sense, or no? There are different levels of responsibility. The provincial government looks after different things than what the municipality looks after. In terms of what you can do in building in a river. For example, you can't just, a municipality can't issue a license to build a dam across a river because it has impacts that are far-reaching outside of the community. You have to go to the province or something like that. You can't fill in a drainage channel with an approval from a local government. That's a provincial responsibility. Does that make sense? That help?
Well, it just seemed to me that actually the provincial government should be in charge of floodplains.
Well, they were at one time, but they decided that they couldn't, that responsibility was, and I'm not going to make a judgment about the wisdom of the province, but they felt that responsibility was better downloaded to communities. So they got out of the business of managing floodplains and of diking responsibility, for example. And those are all local government responsibilities now.
Would any of you like to hazard a guess or an estimation as to how long it would take for what we're calling a floodplain to be recognizable again as a natural, functioning floodplain?
To be direct, if the community retreated, it would take a generation at the most. Nature would take it over and it would become a natural system again in no time at all.
So I still have time.
You still have time.
Thank you.
A question actually for Graham, and I think I might have the terminology right. I think it was on that very last slide. It was a description, I believe it was in the community plan, that natural structures or something?
Assets.
Natural assets. I mean, just in the discussions that apparently were happening in 2017, was there ever any prior idea that North Ruckle would be such a natural asset in the future, or did it just start in the flooding of 2018?
I can totally answer that. The concept of retreating in North Ruckle, of removing that neighborhood, only came about the summer after the flood of 2018. The original driving idea for the Natural Asset Initiative was looking in rural areas within the city, but also upstream and downstream, where decisions about, in one case we saw where a private landowner had put a dike well out on a property, and the the city was concerned about what was the effect downstream on the city itself of having that dike there, what was the loss of storage going to affect. So the Natural Asset Initiative was a nationwide pilot at that time with 5 municipalities, mostly looking at stormwater and how wetlands help stormwater. And that's how we started, but then 2017 happened. And so the study focus looked instead at what was the impact of using the whole floodplain and building it up or putting dikes on it versus, especially in rural areas, having more room for the river to flow. And the example, just within the city limits, in a fairly small study area, could be measured downtown in the overall flood impact. But the model they used was incredibly coarse. I think the model that's available now could be used to study that question again and for any future changes in the floodplain. But yeah, that was a new concept in 2018.
Yes.
I think this is for the city. So what plan is there about dikes for the downtown core?
Sure, so there's going to be a whole other meeting on that soon. We do have a map in the handout here that shows the locations of the dikes. So the future dikes, the main ones in the downtown area would go down Riverside Drive between Riverside and the Granby River, and then wrap around from the Forks and come in towards City Park, near the Spray Park, and towards Selkirk College. So kind of wrapping around the edge of downtown. The exact alignment will need to be figured out by the engineers who will kind of look at the exact location it needs to be. And so at this point, it's a conceptual plan that estimates what the total cost would be, but it doesn't get down to the exact line. And there's a couple of other dikes that have been identified as well, and I believe that the overall plan and schedule will be brought back to council for talking about the timeline in December, and there should be a public meeting about that next steps in that process either in December or January.
Greg, with that dike that you just talked about, how do you balance the impact of what you're going to save with that dike versus the impact on the current riparian area where you'd be putting that dike?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good one. So if you look at the location of the dikes, most of them are setback dikes where they wouldn't be directly against the stream. In areas where they need to be right next to the river because of infrastructure and that kind of thing, a lot of it is highly modified already, where there's some riprap or concrete blocks or tires or that kind of thing. And the main riparian thing that is of major concern is the cottonwood trees and the Lewis woodpecker habitats in those spots specifically. So in any areas where we'll be interacting with the stream itself, trying to mitigate or prevent damage from those impacts on site with the design, and then also offsetting in another location with the creation of more restored riparian area or off-channel habitat, a place where fish can go, like in the outlet to the Johnson Flats wetland, fish can go up into that wetland area during a high flood to get out of the stream. That's considered the habitat. So if that wetland area were to be able to be increased, which is part of the plan, that can help offset some other impacts in stream. So we actually have a regulatory planning project coming up that we'll definitely be interested in.
Okay, sort of 3 parts. First of all, with the building of the dike, was there predictions for the floodplain mapping with that as part of this? So that was done? Okay, it was included already. The second one had to do with drafting the floodplain bylaw. And was I correct in understanding that Urban Systems isn't making recommendations for the new draft, or the city's going to come up with something? How are they coming up with the draft?
We are preparing a draft.
Okay, so you're going to give a proposal for them and to consider?
Yes, exactly. We will be working back and forth on this draft bylaw. And the main component of the bylaw is it incorporates the new maps, but there's other components too. So yeah, it's
okay, updating recommendations. And the third part was the official community plan. Am I correct in understanding that the community can be involved in that part, and that's going to be worked on in 2020? Is that correct? Or?
It's not in the budget yet, but I believe it's a concept that the staff is going to be bringing forward to council. Council has requested some major updates in the big planning documents. So this is one of the topics that would be addressed in those updates in 2020. It's a big process that involves a lot of the community involvement for sure.
Sorry, I think there was there one here? No? Okay.
So I think it partly got answered, but I take it then that the floodplain mapping, the mitigation, and the bylaw are all interconnected then, in the sense that the mitigation for flood prevention is reflected in your updated mapping, and whatever comes next, whether it's the bylaw or the actual mitigation, follows that. So maybe you can speak to that.
Just one thing that I would clarify, and I'll get to my phone. One thing I'd clarify is that the maps represent an existing condition, but within the study, so there's a study report that gets produced, we under a normal process, we would propose mitigative measures, the construction of dikes and things like that. But because of the process, because the flood actually happened, there was a separate process where the city engaged another company to actually undertake some preliminary flood protection works. We incorporated those proposed works into our analysis. So they were basically running parallel. The reason they had to run parallel is because there was a deadline for getting an application in for the $50 million that the community ought to undertake the flood protection works. So they had to run in parallel. Our analysis looked at the impact if you build this dike. This is the effect it has if you build this dike. This is the effect it has. So the analysis has been done, but the flood maps don't reflect. The flood maps represent the condition that's there.
Okay.
Yeah, to be clear, the proposed bylaw will be based on the existing conditions. And you would have to change the bylaw after the dikes are built to reflect different conditions.
So bylaw comes first, then the mitigation, is what you're saying?
In this case, yes.
In this case.
And we've looked around at a lot of different municipalities who are doing multiple steps at once, and there is no standard. It's basically people identify the priority, undertake a work program, find funding for doing more work, and really how it rolls out is almost happenstance. The timing of a major grant like this, which is very, very unusual, the timing of this major grant accelerated a bunch of the work and basically to bring forward decisions that was, basically it changed your work program as well, because you were here looking at flood impacts at the beginning rather than going through the normal flow of this.
Excuse me, I assume this information is available online. Where would I find it?
When you say this information, you're talking about the presentation?
It's the presentation of the maps, yes.
Yeah, the maps are in a draft format right now, but we can certainly make the presentation available, and Graham, you're welcome to put, because you guys can put whatever information you want on your website. That's fine with us. Recognizing that the maps are draft until they're actually accepted by the city of Granby. But certainly the presentation we can make available, and the city can make it available.
Am I better off to ask Graham then when he's going to put it on the website?
And I can give you a timeline for that. So if we're on track for the December Committee of the Whole introduction of the draft floodplain bylaw, we'll publish the maps at the same time as that deadline. That way, if there's anything that we wanted to change on these maps, we'll give these times, especially the cross-hatching that represents an analysis area, that kind of thing. We'll make sure that we've got the package that would be close enough to what it will look like in the bylaw. We'll have that ready for the December Committee of the Whole.
So what you're telling me is don't go looking for it on the website
Not yet.
December the 16th.
We'll get the presentation up before then, this presentation up before then, and I believe Les's recording will be available as well. And then this rest of this material will be in December.
Okay, I think there was something over here.
A question about 2 slides back.
Can you flip back?
2 slides. Can you flip back 2 slides? There. That one?
Yeah, just the red areas. What are the red areas?
Oh, okay. So on that map, that is the actual official community plan that's in in place right now. Those red areas are just, that is the land use map. It's just a sample of a map in the official plan. So the red areas are the commercial areas. The yellow areas are residential areas, like the light yellow areas are residential areas.
Okay.
So yeah, it has nothing to do with flooding whatsoever.
Hey, that's why I was wondering why it was up there.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay, so this just to get clarity. So these maps are predictions before any new dikes are put up.
Yes.
So there will be new maps, so, and then we will get to see what the predictions are for different areas with the dikes.
Yes.
Right.
But, and we don't see them yet, or when can we see those?
Well, because we don't know, I mean, the reason that they don't get produced is because when we're creating these maps, like in a lot of circumstances, it could be 5 years before a community does anything. So in this particular case, as Graham pointed out, it just happened to have been a significant government program that made money available, but it'll still be a couple of years before a dike will actually be in place, because it takes a while to get it approved, to get it built, that sort of stuff, get it designed. The maps are much more easily updatable now because the technology is such that the underlying fuels can be modified, updated relatively quickly, and then new maps can be produced very easily. But they will be produced when the city actually goes ahead with a capital program to do something that alters the floodplain.
So once they've made finalized decisions of what kinds of dikes, exactly where they are, then there will be maps that goes with them.
One of the things that you can be comforted in knowing is that any of the works that are proposed in the building program, they do not have a big impact on the water surface elevations. They're improvements to some areas that are not significant in terms of conveyance capacity, and also part of the program is a withdrawal from an area that used to be dike. So assuming that those go in place in tandem, then the effect on the water surface elevation is not great. When the dikes are built, the water surface elevation in these maps does not change a great deal in comparison to how much it changed from the 1992 maps to today. Yes?
The back. Oh, okay. So what you're saying, okay.
Sorry, over here.
I didn't sorry.
Oh, you did have that?
There's a hand up here. Oh, yeah, it's spoken, yeah.
Oh, there's a hand up here. Yes, it's spoken.
Are you saying that there's probably not going to be any dirt moving in 2020?
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So next year, the work that will be underway for the most part is the engineering and permitting. The downtown stormwater is something that we hope to undertake once the ground is dry later on next year. It's got the least amount of permitting. Most works would be undertaken in 2021. And there will be a whole meeting just about that coming up pretty soon. The other thing I just wanted to point out is we've got an excellent flood response plan now. And when combined with the data in this mapping program, each neighborhood has site-specific proposals. So I understand the city and the regional district will be coming out with a presentation before the spring flood, especially if it looks like there's anything, just for showing exactly what the resources are and what the impacts are.
What you were saying about the data over how many years was it? 80?
Yeah, let's say 80
years. Any particular year did not really affect that a lot.
No.
And we have floodplain maps that are just a very little different from what we had. The usefulness or feasibility of any works that might be beneficial now would have also been beneficial, let's say, 5 years ago, for the most part, one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, your circumstances haven't changed.
Okay.
You have two major rivers that run through the heart of your community. The data says that the water services for this particular design.
That specific flood year does not make a big difference in the overall look.
No, it's the whole data set that moves the numbers up.
Thank you.
Yeah, as opposed to the one event does not skew the data set.
Just briefly, can I see a show of hands of any other questions as we're winding through the evening here? Any other questions to come up? Should always
Just a curious sort of thing. Other areas have used houses built on what you call pillars or stilts. For example, in Hawaii, people build along the beaches and they fully expect to have water coming in, and they do that and they put their carports underneath. That's one idea. And the other one was, oh, no, I forget. Anyway, I would like you to comment on that. Oh, breakwaters is the other one.
Sure. In terms of building on, like elevating houses, it works really well in warmer climates for two reasons. One, you can imagine in the wintertime when it gets cold here, one of the things your basement does is it actually stops the cold air from going underneath your house. If you have a foundation that's built up above, you basically have a little cube that's sitting up in the air, so the ability to heat that, your energy costs go up potentially significantly. But beyond that, it's certainly an idea. It just nobody seems to do it in Canada. I can't think of any places where I've ever seen it. But it's one of the measures that you can do to avoid flooding when you know what the water surface elevation is. You always have to be mindful in a case like this. Like a lot of places that you're talking about, it's actually ocean flooding, where an ocean tide level comes up or a storm surge happens in a hurricane. So the velocities in the water are not the same as they are in a river that's flowing. You have to be mindful of erosion. So anytime water is flowing, like past a bridge, it'll actually scour around the piers underneath the bridge. So you have to design the foundation so it's deep enough to guard against that scouring. But it can be done. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay, cool.
There's actually a couple of houses in Johnson Flats, one on 12th and one on 17th that are built on these tubes.
They're on a pile of dirt, essentially. Yes, they built.
Don't know that they're pillars like.
Oh, really? Okay. And they're open underneath.
No, they closed them up.
Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, so they raised the elevation. Okay. Yeah. But they built something around like they enclosed it.
Yeah, they closed it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Keep the frost out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You can always build a tall structure. Yeah.
Media or any comments from our representatives?
So the enhanced or improved mapping that you've done with LiDAR, et cetera, updated. It's like 20 odd years since the last floodplain mapping had been done to any even close to that. How long do we have to wait before we have more updates like that in the future? Like, I know that you can't really do anything until after you've done the actual dike work and stuff, but is it going to be 10 years after that, 20 years after that?
Well, as Graham said earlier, communities should be revisiting this on a regular basis. The fundamental question is, in a situation like this, is there something that has changed that informs us that we're in a different set of circumstances than we were? So, for example, if the next 10 years, let's say climate change plays a role and all of a sudden you're getting more significant events than you would have historically had in the past. And, it's always hard to say what is actually happening in any particular year. But if the frequency with which you experience a more significant event occurs, that's an indication that something is changing in the hydrology and the hydraulics. Climate change is such that, particularly in a circumstance like this, there's two potential scenarios that can happen. And they depend on winter temperatures. So if winter temperatures tend to be around freezing or slightly above freezing, you'll actually get more rain in the winter, which means rain, of course, comes off when it happens. But if the temperature stays below freezing, increased amounts of winter precipitation will arrive as snow. And if you get more and more snow, so if your snow accumulation goes up and you have warmer temperatures in the spring when the onset is quicker, you can get more significant flooding as a result of climate change. But you might actually get the opposite, because you may find yourself in a circumstance where enough of the watershed is actually affected by temperatures in the wintertime that cause the precipitation to arrive as rain rather than as snow. So snow is stored, rain comes off right away. So you may find that your actual springtime flooding is diminished because you have more rain in the winter in the watershed rather than less. And all I'm saying is that's a hypothetical where there's two potential trajectories that could have an impact. But you won't know for 5 or 10 years. You need a lot of data to make those kinds of conclusions, or to draw those sorts of conclusions.
And that silver lining you just described takes us away from flooding, but takes us towards a tinderbox that'll burn. So.
There's the, yes, and that's a good point. That's the other end of the spectrum, is now you don't have that stuff that, saturates things in the summertime. And yes, well, in fact, that's something that's been happening in BC. And a couple of years doesn't make a trend, but the numbers of years in the past few years that we've had flooding followed by forest fires is shocking to most people. Who knows what the fundamental cause is, but.
So while I've got you here to ask you the question,
sure.
Over the last 15, 20, 30 years, have you seen any difference in how hydrology is changing as a result of mass burnouts with forests? Like, does it make a difference for retention of snow? Does it make a difference for silting and water retention, or does it flow faster? Are there any variables that change?
Yeah, well, certainly the thing that, any time that there's a natural disaster like a forest fire, it changes forest hydrology. It changes the structure of the forest, so that, what used to rain on a bunch of trees, and the trees absorb the vast majority of the water. So if you have large areas that have been impacted by a forest fire, that water now comes off very, very quickly. It changes things in a lot of ways. It changes your base flow conditions. So any of the rainfall comes off very quickly. You don't have any detention. But the thing that I would say we as practicing engineers don't have enough information about right now is a long-term trend with respect to changes in hydrology. The climate scientists will tell you that the trend is there, but we don't see it in the data. Like, it's not a smoking gun in the data at this point where you can look at particular trends in how much rainfall actually happens. There are some circumstances where you can, but it's not always apparent.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Given that the maps are more dynamic now than they used to be, I wonder if the public will get a chance to see kind of what would happen if what would happen under different infrastructure options.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great one for when our design engineers come on to start doing the next steps and are understanding, especially the specific layouts. I think what Cameron spoke to earlier is the suite of things that they looked at a preliminary point. It's not as big of a difference compared to the old floodplain maps, the new floodplain maps. So it might have a minor effect on a flood construction level in one place or another. There are some site-specific areas where it's a greater concern, and we'll be asking our engineers to look at those to make sure that if the dike goes up on one side of the river, to make sure that directly across the river isn't negatively impacted. If it is, what the specific remedies for that are. I think at this point we know at a broader scale it's not as big of a deal, but it's something that we're definitely paying attention to.
Yeah, last question, gentlemen. Just, Cameron, you mentioned that it would be ideal if the city updated its floodplain mapping approximately every 10 years.
Okay, I'm not sure I said that, but...
I said that there was a real estate association project 8-9 years ago that they had best practices for floodplain mapping in BC from a municipal perspective, and it spawned a bunch of other work that happened, and they said that we should be updating in that frequency.
Let's say we get proactive enough to update it even every 15 years. What would your estimate of the cost be 15 years to do it, every 15 years?
Well, I couldn't put a number to it, but I can tell you this, it's less expensive now because the tools that are available, and you know, this is one of the things that has changed a great deal in the time that I've been doing this work. Like I say, it started in 1987, and I just made a comment today about how amazed I am at some of the tools that we have now that we simply didn't have at our disposal. So there's you know, it's a computer program,
right?
But it's a very powerful computer program that isn't going anywhere. The tool that we use today, or you know, it's in one of these posters here. It's called GeoCat.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is something that was developed 50 years ago by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but at that time it was called HEC-2. Hydraulic Engineering Center 2 was the second computer program that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers produced for hydrology and hydraulics. But we're using the same platform, it's just that the tool is much more powerful now in terms of what it can do. So it'll be around. The next update is going to be so much easier to do than this update.
But, I mean, is it something that a city this size could afford?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay,
yes.
I guess.
In fact, you know, not to suggest that the city should do this, but there are people within the city right now who, you know, can actually operate these tools with a little bit of training.
That answers my question, I think, pretty much. I mean, we don't have to have 3 or 4 engineers and 5 helicopters come in and do this all over again.
You do not, right?
Okay.
I only had 1 engineer this time around.
Okay.
And no helicopter.
Any final comments from any staff or representatives here tonight? We'll leave the last word to you.
Thank you. I would like to post a vote of thanks to you all, your team, Graham, your team, Brian, your team, and city staff. This cannot be much of a welcome burden on you all because of the ramifications of it. But I'm looking forward to your results as a stepping stone into a much brighter future for us all. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming out and staying through many technical questions. I'm really impressed. So that's great.